So sometimes it can seem like the world is coming to an end. This can happen in grand ways, say like facing climate disaster. Or it can happen in small, mundane, everyday ways, say when an unexpected illness breaks into your life. Those who watched nuclear bombs drop on their world in Hiroshima surely felt as if the world was coming to an end. Genocides from the Holocaust on down through the last several decades have been active attempts to end the worlds of specific communities. Migrants and refugees who cross deserts and oceans and borders have watched their world end and are journeying to another. And all of us, paying attention to our current and pending climate disasters, understand that the world as our ancestors knew it is coming to an end right in front of our eyes. In addition to the auditory doom scrolling I just subjected you to, there are others who are actively trying to end the world, but in liberative ways. Prison and police industrial complex abolitionists are working daily to end the world of mass incarceration, even as they begin to birth another one. Others actively seek to end the worlds of capitalism, of borders, of racism, sometimes even of race itself, and much, much more. The world, it seems, is always ending, for better or for worse. Our world, with its 24-hour news channels, social media feeds, and group chats, can make it feel like we're always in crisis, always facing the end of one world or another. Sometimes the prospect of the end of one world is exciting. Other times it's frightening. But when it's constant, it can feel overwhelming. So my question is, how are we to live in a world that's always in the last days? We may be tempted to think we're the first humans to feel like the world is ending. At least the first ones to feel that way as frequently as we do today. But people throughout history have had that feeling, and paying attention to their responses might serve as a resource for us today as we face the end of the world. In ancient Jewish literature, the end of the world genre is called apocalyptic. The book of Daniel is the most famous of these, but apocalyptic can be found in parts of the wisdom literature, the prophets, and more. Ancient Jewish apocalyptic was a diaspora literature, a genre created and written while they were in exile, far from home, facing oppression and displacement. The people of Israel wrote apocalypse. In today's world, especially among some Christian communities, we often think of apocalyptic as telling the future in code. However, that's not how the genre was understood in its time. Rather, apocalyptic texts pronounced judgment upon this world, usually some specific society, while making promises or casting visions of another world. Often these judgments and promises were made using cryptic or fantastical images, and some have suggested that such a code was necessary for imperial powers to ignore these radically revolutionary texts. A well-known example of this genre can be found in the book of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 65. For I'm about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. I'm about to create Jerusalem as a joy and its people as a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it, or the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered a curse. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity, for they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord, and their descendants as well. Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, but the serpent, its food shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord. Here in this text, we see the classic markers of apocalypse. The end of one world, a world of oppression, and the vision of another. Early Christians, because many of them were Jews, picked up this tradition as they lived under the imperial rule and oppression of the Roman Empire. Jesus includes apocalyptic stories in his preaching, but the most well-known Christian apocalypse is the book of Revelation. Whereas much ancient Jewish apocalyptic was diasporic, much Christian apocalyptic was written in the heart of the occupation of the Holy Land. This resistance literature, some of Jesus' sermons, the book of Revelation, functions very similarly to Daniel and 3rd Enoch and 4th Ezra in the Hebrew Bible. In Revelation, the Roman Empire is described as a violent dragon, a beast, and more. Its violence sheds blood, especially Christian blood, wherever it goes. And this horrific dragon is defeated violently by a lamb. That is, Jesus. This mythical imagery pronounces judgment on one of the world's most influential empires and promises a new world to come as Revelation ends with this vision. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them, and they will be his peoples, and God will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." I'll go back. There are apocalypses today, though we don't always call them that. One place we see a version of this is in a movement called transformative justice. Emerging most often from the thought and practice of communities of women of color, queer people, and disabled people, especially survivors of violence from these communities. Transformative justice grew alongside the prison industrial complex abolition movement, but it's focused on more than abolishing policing, prisons, and the surveillance state. Egeris Dixon describes transformative justice as ways to address violence without relying on police or prisons. And Adrienne Marie Brown describes it as justice practices that go all the way to the root of the problem and generate solutions and healing there, such that the conditions that create injustice are transformed. Miriam Kaba describes abolition in transformative justice terms when she calls it a political vision, a structural analysis of oppression, and a practical organizing strategy that grows from a vision of a restructured society in a world where we have everything we need. Transformative justice then is not merely defined by what it's against, policing and prisons, but by what it's for. In the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, it's about presence, not absence. It is, quote, a positive project, end quote, that seeks to build a society where it's possible to address harm without relying on structural forms of oppression or the violent systems that increase it. Transformative justice, then, is a holistic vision of justice that includes ending our reliance on the violence of policing and prisons and builds a world where everyone is housed, has enough to eat, has access to the medical care they need, and in which every individual and community is safe. Transformative justice, therefore, works at the level of social structural transformation, grassroots activism, and community-based responses to violence and human need. Because transformative justice emerged alongside abolitionist frameworks, transformative justice interventions are often focused on practices designed to resist, dismantle, and then provide alternatives to dominant legal punishment systems. At the level of social structural transformation, TJ advocates call for what many call non-reformist reforms. That is, reforms that don't expand the size of the prison industrial complex, give it more resources, propose individualistic or technological solutions to systemic problems, or provide public relations cover to police departments that claim to be reforming even as their core functions remain in place or even grow. For example, requiring police to wear body cameras and therefore increasing their budgets is not a non-reformist reform, right? Non-reformist reforms look like policy changes that shrink the reach of the prison industrial complex, that take a power away from police and put it into the hands of communities. Examples of non-reformist reforms might be to shrink police budgets and subsequently reallocate those monies to guarantee basic needs, ending practices like solitary confinement or the death penalty, passing moratoriums on new jail and prison construction, ending cash bail, and ending electronic monitoring, maybe even disarming the police. These non-reformist reforms don't expand the prison industrial complex, rather they shrink its reach and make possible alternatives not rooted in violence and retribution. So that's social structural transformation. At the level of grassroots activism, transformative justice looks like the movements that lead to such non-reformist reforms. It might look like protests or civil disobedience in response to another killing of someone by the police, the wrongful incarceration of a political prisoner, or someone incarcerated for protecting themselves in an instance of intimate violence. One particularly impressive movement in transformative justice was Reparations Now, a campaign which secured $5.5 million in reparations for 57 victims of torture by Chicago police, as well as a public memorial, inclusion of this story in Chicago public school curriculum, and free admission to local community colleges for family members of torture victims. At the level of community-based responses, transformative justice seeks to create models of care for victims, accountability for those who cause harm, especially violence, and violence prevention initiatives that are not connected to formal state systems. So at the heart of transformative justice and abolition is the conviction that policing and prisons don't decrease violence or increase safety. Rather, for many people, involvement with the legal punishment system increases the likelihood that they will experience violence. It's especially true, we know, that those who are incarcerated are likely to experience more violence in their lives by going to jail or prison than if they don't. So this community-based work is the level at which some of the most creative and imaginative work in transformative justice is happening. For example, the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective has created a collection of community-based pods. Pods are small groups of people who have agreed to provide specific supports to one another, especially if you're a victim of violence. Need support in taking accountability for violence you've done to another person, or are a witness to violence or know of someone experiencing violence. Once someone has identified their pod, there are 4, 5, 6 people who they can rely upon. They are able to have their needs met in regards to violence without subjecting themselves or others to the various violences and traumas of the legal punishment system. The violence of arrest, the risk of assault, both physical and sexual, when imprisoned, the trauma of having to recount one's experience in a clinical way, often while being questioned or disbelieved, the trauma of having family or friends incarcerated, the potential violent retribution that comes from police involvement in cases, and more. Pods work by providing safety, opportunities for accountability, and preventative interventions without reliance upon state institutions. So, all of that is, in short, to say that transformative justice is a movement that seeks a world where everyone has their needs met, where we and our communities are safe, and where justice looks more like healing than like punishment. A world where safety is held communally and accountability looks like repair. Transformative justice works to build the kind of world in which the absence of prisons is possible. Transformative justice practitioners seek to do this in many ways. One way is by exercising what Adrienne Marie Brown has called science-fictional behavior. That is, living in the present as if a different future were possible now. In fact, one way to exercise these muscles is to write science fiction, to write other worlds that spark and exercise our imagination for what's possible. At the heart of this idea is the belief that our imaginations have been truncated, that our imagination muscles have atrophied, that the world we've inherited has conned us into believing it's the only world that's possible. What would a world without environmental degradation look like? What would a world without prisons look like? Can any of us in this room really envision such a world? Prisons haven't always existed, yet we are so bound by the prison imagination we can't even remember an old world without them, let alone imagine a new one. To envision a new world, which is necessary to build and live in one, requires what Mariam Kaba calls a, quote, jailbreak of the imagination, end quote. We need to break out of the boxes we've received that confine us. We need liberation from the worlds we've seen so we can imagine and practice new worlds into being. Such new visions and new worlds don't just happen, however. They're made by people with the creativity, strength, and courage to sci-fi their way to something new. There once was a time when the enslavement of Africans in the Americas was taken for granted. Many couldn't imagine a world without slavery, but some people did. They imagined freedom as Exodus and Promised Land. They imagined lives without chains in a world of equality. They imagined modern-day Moseses and Aarons and Miriams who would bring freedom in the desert. And they planted seeds and practiced ways of being together and helped bring about a world that was previously unimaginable to many. As Octavia Butler's novel Kindred reminds us, even the creation of a world without slavery can be understood as science fiction. Kindred is the story of a black woman in the late 20th century named Dana, who gets caught in a weird series of time portals where she goes back and forth in time to the era of enslavement and today. Over time, she discovers she has a white ancestor who enslaved her African ancestors, and with whom she has a weird psychological connection across the ages. By the end of the story, Dana has killed her ancestor enslaver, named Rufus, and she has lost an arm, a mark of enslavement and her ties to Rufus that will never go away. For Rufus and the others Dana encounters in the times of enslavement, the contemporary world she lives in with her white husband is a fever dream. And yet, that world really does exist. Abolition then, just like abolition now, really can feel like science fiction. Mariam Kaba, a leading transformative justice thinker and practitioner, shows us science-fictional imagination in her short story titled Justice that you were sent to read to prepare for our retreat. In the story, Adila and the people of Small Place live in a world that's not our world. A world without economic inequality, gender binaries, carceral systems, or ecological devastation. And when someone from Earth, called EV for Earth Visitor, lands in Small Place, their imagination is so constrained, they murder Adila to prove that Earth's imagination of punitive justice really is just how it is, and that small place really is unrealistic. Through a series of rituals, circles, and practices of relationship, Evie ends up adopted by Adila's family, and prisons don't actually come to small place. Love, not revenge, is the response to harm. Adila, narrating the story, says, "And so it was that my community held Evie in her humanity while seeking to hold her accountable for her actions." And Adila concludes her story by asking, when we hold each other in our humanity, what other outcome could there be? After all, she says, vengeance is not justice. This, I want to suggest to you, is a modern apocalypse. The way that transformative justice practitioners and activists talk about science fictional imagination, which I'm suggesting is akin to ancient apocalyptic thinking, reminds me of how conflict transformation, John Paul Lederach, talks about the moral imagination. Writing after decades of conflict and peace work around the globe, Lederach says that the ability to exercise the moral imagination is what makes transformation in intractable violence and injustice possible. He calls the moral imagination the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist. Elsewhere, he highlights relationship, curiosity, creativity, and risk as central elements of the moral imagination. Drawing on his work, I want to recommend that risky creativity is the work that the ancients called apocalypse, and what contemporary transformative justice advocates call science fictional behavior. That is, the moral imagination is an ability to create a story or an image or a vision that simultaneously condemns the world we have, that declares its end, while inspiring a new world that we might not yet know. Moral theologian and restorative justice scholar Amy Lavad, influenced by Lederach's definition, defines moral imagination as the cognitive faculty that gives us the power to create images of our world and its possibilities. Beyond seeing the world as it is, then, Lavad describes moral imagination as a way of interpreting our world and creating the, quote, narratives, metaphors, and symbols, end quote, of what it could be. In particular, she highlights the vivid and expansive ways restorative justice practices can empower, quote, human beings to create images of their world and its possibilities, end quote, beyond retribution and toward restoration. In Lederach and Lavad, theorists working in conversation with people working to transform their lives and worlds, we see that moral imagination is about seeing and describing the world as it is, and then acting to transform our world toward new visions and possibilities. In short, there's a way to think of moral imagination as apocalyptic thinking. Or perhaps better, apocalyptic is a form of moral imagination. Among restorative justice teachers, it's common to show people the dominant Western image of justice. A woman wearing a blindfold, holding scales and a sword. Her name is Lady Justice. Her blindfold tells us that justice is blind, that it does not pay attention to our differences or our particularities, that justice is universal. The scales remind us that justice is about balance, fairness, and equality. That injustice is when things are out of balance. And her sword reminds us that justice sometimes requires punishment, even violence. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, or what your circumstances are, we are all subject to Lady Justice. At least, this is the dominant image, the dominant imagination of justice in our society. Restorative justice teachers and practitioners, however, often invite us to create a new image of justice that aligns with the values of restorative justice. If you take my class next semester, we're going to do this exercise. Those images so invite us to create a new image of justice. An image of justice where harm is repaired, wounds are healed, relationships restored, and accountability is practiced. These images often come in the shape of a circle, or an image of embrace, or imprisonment, whatever the crime or circumstance. Restorative justice leans into particularity to seek healing. Rather than a mere balancing of the scales, restorative justice seeks the birth of new ways of being in relationship with one another. Rather than emphasizing punishment, restorative justice emphasizes accountability as repair. The images are different, and so the world they create are different. Miriam Kaba has done something similar to this exercise on several occasions. She has organized various transformative justice art projects that invite people to imagine a new world. Some of these include the projects titled Community Safety Looks Like, Picturing a World Without Prisons, and the Restorative Posters Project. The Community Safety Looks Like project. It's a photo project. Community Safety Looks Like Unity. Community safety looks like more gun laws for police. Community safety looks like police accountability. Community safety looks like restorative justice. Community safety looks like young and old and in between looking out for each other. Community safety looks like accountability. And on the project goes. This is another art project that Kaba helped to organize. And these are images of what a world without prisons might look like. Stop on this one. This is the Free Milk Project. Something like that, if you scroll down just a little bit. Milk Not Jails. And it's a mutual aid endeavor. A plate. A dinner setting. I believe in living, I believe in birth. A tree in fall. A mural. Graphings from Joliet. And go to the last one, the Restorative Posters Project. The point of these exercises, these art projects, is to expand our moral imagination. Just a bit. To invite a jailbreak of the imagination. To become an apocalyptic prophet or a science fictional thinker. The point is to cast a new vision of a new world in the midst of a dying one that might bring that new world into being. The ancient Jewish prophets did this. They imagined worlds where lions lay with lambs, where babies and serpents played together, where weapons of war are converted into farm equipment, where people from all nations gather together to worship together. Jesus participated in this same tradition. He imagined worlds where banquet tables are full of society's outcasts, where the poor are elevated and the rich are humbled, where enemies are turned into friends and where the greatest wash feet. And throughout history, others have carried on the tradition of apocalyptic imagination, of science fictional thinking. Gandhi imagined a free India where independence looked like homespun cloth. Sojourner Truth imagined a world of racial and gender equality where women preach. Harriet Tubman imagined a promised land where the descendants of enslaved Africans might experience peace. Dorothy Day imagined houses of hospitality among the poorest of the poor. Martin Luther King Jr. imagined a beloved community and a world house. Desmond Tutu imagined a rainbow nation. Thich Nhat Hanh imagined a field of lotus flowers. And Angela Davis imagined a world without prisons. Each of those visions cast seeds that are sprouting up all around us. That's how apocalypses work. Out of the fire emerges new life. Out of the ruins, new communities. Or, as Tupac Shakur would say, out of the concrete, a field of roses. So my question for you today is, what do you imagine at the end of the world? What transformation is possible in our conflicts? What visions shall we cast? What seeds shall we plant so that our science fiction is our grandchildren's reality?